I'm hoping. All right. Yep, I'm seeing a thumbs up. Fabulous. Okay. So as you can see, I'm calling this With a Little Help from My Friends, or How I Joined a Community of Awesomeness, and you can too. So a lot of this is going to be a story about me and how I got to where I am. But I want you to understand and really pay attention to the different pieces of my story, because there were a lot of people that without their help and without their guidance, I wouldn't be where I am today. And, you know, a lot of what Sean said in the very beginning during his keynote about community to me is huge. And everything that I do now in terms of speaking, in terms of, you know, the book that I wrote, which we'll talk about, you know, it's all about community. So that's really at the heart of all of this. And the community is more than just the people on Twitter or the people in particular discords or the people in specific places. It's everybody that you might meet that may play a role in your universe. So let's get started here. So these are just kind of the subsections of what I'll be talking about within my story. So this is a little bit about me. I am currently the principal technology architect for security at the University of Buffalo. I've been with UB for over 24 years now. It's been very good to me, and you'll see in a little bit why and how my journey at UB even was impacted by the community. I'm on staff with a bunch of conferences. I volunteer with a bunch of other things. I speak all over the place. And the most important bit, I love sloths. And folks who have heard me speak often remember that little tidbit, if nothing else, which is fun. Flash is my adopted sloth at the Buffalo Zoo. So that's my little guy up there. All right. So for those of you who have been in this business for a little while, this is going to take you back. It's going to be a reminder of how things were, right? And for those of you who don't have that history, it's going to be a history lesson of sorts. So let's go to my early years. So this is what was in my house at about 1979, was this little tiny terminal. It's an ADM-A3, and it was connected to a Burroughs mainframe at the college where my father was director of computing services. And so I've seen some comments about people saying, you know, you don't know what you don't know. Well, one of the things I didn't know was just how rare and unique that really was. But this technology was in my house from the time I was very little. And, you know, my dad started that job. We moved to the area when I was 4, and it wasn't too long before that terminal found its way into our house. So this was an introduction to computing at a very young age. Of course, nothing would be complete without games, right? So the picture in the lower left-hand corner is actually of the computing center in that college where I grew up. They're installing the Burroughs 6800 mainframe. And with the Burroughs 6800 mainframe came the games. It took an individual to bring them from another school, but he brought them on tapes and he uploaded them. And then we had games. And the first game that I became very enamored with was something called Adventure, also known as Colossus Cave. It was a text-based game. It was super fun. I spent many, many hours playing it, and this particular version, I believe, was written in Fortran. So, you know, we're talking a very, very long time ago, but this was my introduction to computing in a way that I think most people could not relate to. Now, not only did we have a terminal in our house, folks, this was a direct connection to the college. This was not a dial-up, use a modem, listen to the screechy noises. This was an always-on, constant thing available to sit down and poke at all times. So not only did I have really early technology in my house and at my disposal, but I had it in a way that really was very unique, because for most folks to have that sort of connection, they usually had to be on a college campus or work for some place, maybe like the DoD or other research universities. And in my case, I had it right in my house. So moving on. So fast forward to the early 80s, my dad would bring home a whole bunch of other different kinds of hardware. One thing he brought home was the Atari 800. What was cool about the Atari 800? Well, I learned how to start tinkering with BASIC. That was the first programming language that I started to tinker with. But more importantly to me at that age, it could play Pac-Man. It could play all kinds of cartridge games. So that was pretty badass. And, then he would bring home other things like on the bottom right-hand side, the first portable computer, which was literally called the Compact Portable. And as you can see, it's about the size of a suitcase. It was very, very, very heavy. And it could do things like play Flight of the Bumblebee and do, all kinds of other text-based silliness. But it was very, very basic. Not as basic as the Atari, of course. There was also an Apple IIe in my father's office where I played Frogger. And for those of you from this generation, all right, Oregon Trail, anyone? Yeah, I played my Oregon Trail. But understand, again, that we're talking about a time, I was 7, 8, 9 when this was happening. So it's funny when I have conversations with folks in this business who were telephone freaking or hacking in other ways, and we have very similar memories, but I was much, much, much younger. All right, so let's fast forward. Now I'm in high school, and while this picture on the left may seem like it is sort of not relevant because I'm not talking about computing here, we'll see why this becomes relevant. There were a couple different things that I was very heavily involved in high school. One of them was the musical theater program, which I actually started getting involved in middle school, but was not really in productions until high school. That is me playing the role of Mary Magdalene on the stage at a very early age. I bring this up because you will see this ultimately plays a pretty important role in how I wound up giving talks later on. I also was gifted my very first laptop. And that is the thing on the right-hand side. It was a Toshiba T1000LE, and it had no hard drive. It had 2 floppy disks. One of those floppies you ran DOS from. The other one, Word Star. So predating WordPerfect and Word and all the things that folks now have heard of was something called WordStar. And it was a great little program. And I started taking college courses while I was still in high school. And this was super awesome, not only because I got high school credit for college things and college credit for high school things, but also because having that laptop meant I could write papers anywhere. And in fact, there were more than one occasion where I had a paper due in, say, 3rd period, and I would write it in 1st and 2nd period, go upstairs to the art room, plug it into the dot matrix printer, and print it out and hand it in 3rd period. So that was a thing. But you'll see all of this ultimately leads me where I go. So in 1992, I follow a boy. I follow a boy to Boston. Now, I would not recommend this, and I will back up briefly by saying an awful lot of people ask me, how did you get where you are? Because I want to do this. And I tell them literally that's not possible, in part because technology is totally different from when I was a kid, and partly because I wouldn't necessarily recommend following in my own footsteps, right? So ultimately, I started Northeastern. I went to Northeastern University. I transferred my credits from Fredonia State, which is where I'd started. And at Northeastern, I majored in music industry. That was my degree. The very first thing that happened after I got settled on campus was that I wanted to get access back to that mainframe. I still had an account, and this was in the old days where telnetting back to these systems was easy enough to do. And it was very convenient because I could still play games. One of the other things that I could do is I could have online chat conversations. So for those of you who think that Discord and Slack are, you know, the ability to have these online discussions is a new thing. Oh, no, my friends. And even for those of you who might have you know, had experience with AOL Instant Messenger or MSN or going back ICQ, right? Or even some of the earlier programs, you could, in fact, instant message folks right on the mainframe terminal. There was a command you could put in that would give you a list of everybody's username that was logged in and their terminal ID number. And with that information, you could send a message. And I used to do that frequently with my dad. So I get to Northeastern. Now, this is really the beginning of part of my community story. I meet a man whose name is Dave. The way I meet this man is I walk into the help center and I ask for a computer account, because in those days, that was not a normal thing that all students got. You didn't just get a computer account, you had to come ask for it. So I walked in and I asked for one and they gave me one, and I walked down the hall and I went to the lab and I tried to log in with my account and it didn't work. And I thought, all right, things happen. I walked back and I asked the person who's, I believe was a student assistant behind the desk, and said, you know, this account's not working. Can you please look into it? She disappears. I wait a little while. She eventually returns. She comes back. She says, I think it's all set now. I walk down to the lab. I attempt to log in. It doesn't work. I come back to the office and we go through this again. And she says, you know, oh, that's really strange. I'm very sorry. I'll see what I can do to help. She disappears. I wait for a while. She comes back. She says, you know, we're really not sure, but you know, we made a change and it should be working now. Now, one of the things that I didn't mention, I grew up in a very, very small town. Moving to Boston was a huge change for me. It was little tiny town, giant major metropolitan city that I am now living in the middle of, because Northeastern University is right in the heart of downtown Boston. I was homesick, and that was hard. And even though I followed this young man here, he was attached to the Navy. And it wasn't like he stayed in my dorm with me and he wasn't available all the time. So that was really hard. So I go down to the lab, try again, doesn't work. I come back. Now, you remember that friend of mine named Dave? Here's how I met Dave. I walk back in, I explain my situation, and I say, look, this account it's still not working. And this nice man, Dave, opens his door and he says, you know, I hear you're having some difficulties. What can I do to help you? And at this point, a very, very homesick me gets very upset and says, I just want to talk to my daddy. Because at that point, the only thing I could think about was logging in to be able to have a conversation with my dad. So Dave was very kind. And so Dave ultimately got my account working. To this day, I don't remember what the issue was, but he was a senior Unix admin and he got everything working. And I walked down to the lab after that and I logged in, and my dad and I had a great chat. And that became helpful because even from my dorm room with that little laptop you saw, I was able to log in and have conversations. So that helped. That helped me a lot. One of the other things that happened, even though this was a music industry program, we took classes in both music and business. One of the things that we took was actually a class in Microsoft Office. So, you know, it may seem second nature to those of you who are, you know, relatively young and grew up having all of this, but having access to something like Word, I had used WordStar. Everything was text-based. There were no GUIs. That wasn't a thing. So we were taught a class on using Office to create a portfolio for a musician. And so that was really my introduction to the Microsoft space, and not a bad thing to know. Okay, so fast forward a little bit. I got my degree. I worked in the music business for a little while, And I wound up having morals and ethics that precluded me from working in this field. I didn't partake of drugs or alcohol. I was working 9+ hours. I was ultimately being paid $300 a week before taxes and living in Boston, which was obscenely low. And I didn't even officially get breaks, which technically was illegal, but I thought, oh, I'm paying my dues, whatever. Well, the relationship with the boy I followed did not work out. My grandmother became ill, and I moved home. I moved home, and I discovered that, of course, there wasn't a whole lot for me to do in the area, except I wound up becoming a manager for a local record store. The unfortunate thing is the gentleman who owned the record store didn't believe in paying his taxes. New York State gets really funny about that kind of thing, and they closed the store. So now I'm stuck. I don't have a job in the music business. My tiny little town didn't have much to offer in that respect. So I called my friend Dave at Northeastern and I said, oh, Dave, I don't know what I'm going to do. And he says to me, Kath, why don't you go into computing? And I said, what the heck do I know about computing? And he said, you really know way more than you think you do. Again, you only know, there's a lot of things you know that you don't realize you know. All right. So in August of 1996, following Dave's advice, ultimately I land a job, my first tech job, doing WordPerfect phone support. So I'm sure there are at least a few of you out there who probably started in phone support land. It is not a good time. It can be very exhausting. It sometimes can be very demeaning. But I'll tell you, I learned a tremendous amount. And when I first was hired, I was hired to do support for WordPerfect 7, and that's that image on the right. The tiny little image you see up in the corner, that is the TRICON building, where the company was. I was working for a company called SoftBank Services Group, and they were the ones that would hire different folks to do support for different entities. So there were modem people, there were people supporting WordPerfect there were Microsoft people doing support there. It was a really interesting space to be in. But apparently I got pretty good at what I was doing because eventually they added me to do support for 5.1 plus, 6.0, 6.0A, and then 7, and then networking and a variety of other like complicated different feature sets that WordPerfect 7 had. So that was my first real tech job. I had supposedly no background in IT, but I'd made that first jump. How did I make that first jump? Community, my friends. It was one friend that I trusted that got me there. So what did I do next? Well, after 9 months being on the phone, I'd really had it, and I knew I needed another job. So I applied, and I got hired by Ingram Micro. Now, what I will tell you is I was so burned out on the phone, I didn't want a tech job. So I took an administrative assistant job for the folks who were doing in-house support. So these were the folks who did computer support in-house. They were not the people doing tech support for all the other things that Ingram does. And for those of you who are not familiar, Ingram at the time was the largest hardware and software reseller in the country, potentially in the world at that point. It was a giant company. But I thought, you know what? I'm just going to do, I'm going to be an administrative assistant. I'm going to handle paperwork. I'm good at organization. I've done managerial stuff before. This is fine. And then I met a man named Paul. And Paul started offering, he began to teach Microsoft classes. Now, this was the very early days of Microsoft certifications. So the very, very early Microsoft certifications were an NT 351. So again, we're going back. This is 1997. And he offered to teach all of our computer support folks this class such that they could study for the exam, and Ingram would pay for the exam. I went to my boss because I was starting to get the itch again to learn something, because forever learning has certainly been something I have enjoyed. And he said, not only can you take the class, but we will pay you for any off hours that you sit in the class, because in many cases it was in the evening after work. And I thought, how wonderful. So I take the class. And it's hard because there's a lot of things I don't really know. But Paul was fabulous. And he offered anybody who wanted tutoring to help prepare for the exam. He said, I'll help you however I can. One of the most beneficial things that Paul did, he taught you how to read the Microsoft questions so that when they would come up on the exam, you knew exactly what they were looking for, which to this day, I think is the trick on most of these certification exams, right? It's one thing to know the real answer. It's another thing to know the right answer according to the company. And it's quite another thing to know exactly what the entity that you're taking the test for actually is looking for. And he was spectacular at that. So the first guy in our group goes and he takes the test, bombs it. And he's somebody who'd been doing support and actually working with NT for quite some time. Then the second guy goes to take it. And he was the golden boy who could do no wrong. Nobody thought there was any chance he'd fail, but he did, and he failed it. But what I will tell you is none of them got help. None of them spent hours afterwards working with Paul, getting this insight, getting help. And in fact, not only did Paul help me with this, but he went on to become a Microsoft trainer for many, many years. And some of the analogies he had to create for me to understand some of these complicated concepts, he wound up using over and over again. But he started them with me, which was pretty cool. So here I am, the admin assistant, and I go to take the test and nobody thought anything of it. But I thought, damn it, I'm going to pass this thing. And I did, and I passed it really well. And, you know, that led me to go on. Ingram ran Novell NetWare, and I wound up getting my CNA in Novell NetWare. So I became a NetWare administrator. I passed that exam. Then I started taking the NT4 exams, and all with Paul as help. And I'll tell you another wild story. At the same time all of this was happening, my father was tasked with building an entire Microsoft NT4 infrastructure in his college, along with managing the mainframe, which was still there. So not only did I continue to take classes, but I took classes from Paul when he went on to be an instructor with another entity, and my dad took those same classes with me. So you want to talk about community, sometimes it's in your own backyard, you never realize. But I became a Microsoft certified professional, and I was there for 2 years. Within, probably 6 months of me getting that certification, I too moved into a tech job. Now it was second shift, which wasn't ideal, but again, here I am, this woman who doesn't really know anything, made my way forward. So by January 1999, I moved to a company called Amherst Systems. Amherst Systems is now owned by Northrop Grumman. So for anybody who recognizes that name, Northrop Grumman is a partner with the military, and they do all kinds of consulting work. In the building where I first started, which I was trying to find a picture of, but it's something else now and it's changed completely. But there used to be a secret room that you could have conversations that were for nobody else to hear. It was a really interesting experience because I'd never done any kind of work for government entities of that kind. And what was fun there too was that I was supporting actual folks who were doing rocket science. So the whole joke about, this isn't rocket science. Yeah, what I was doing really wasn't rocket science, but I'm telling you, the rocket scientists, yeah, the PCs were not their thing either. So we taught each other stuff. So there was some more stuff that I learned from community. I also learned Citrix while I was there. That was what was necessary in many cases. The folks who were at Amherst, they didn't have Windows computers. They had other machines that couldn't necessarily run anything in Windows. So you wanted to get email, and the email was being served through something that, you know, only a Microsoft machine can handle. Well, in comes Citrix WinFrame. And for those of you who are not familiar, it allowed you to run, for example, Windows things on Macs or other sorts of platforms, and it could do a lot more things, but that's essentially what was happening here. And I ultimately finished my MCSE. I became a systems engineer because I finished those classes and, you know, moved on. Now, I got that job because I simply did the thing a lot of people do. I filled out applications, and, you know, I decided that I wanted to stretch my legs and go out on my own. I really wasn't necessarily looking to leave Amherst Systems, but I really loved academia. And so a couple of opportunities for jobs had opened up at the University of Buffalo. I applied for probably half a dozen different jobs, and unfortunately didn't get any of them. In fact, I even talked to a friend of mine who had been working at Ingram, whose boyfriend at the time was working for UB. And I said to him, you know, how do I get in? That's really what I want to do. And we had a whole conversation about that. Well, fast forward to 2000. What's funny about this is, and again, I point back to community, right? Here's somebody who's just, it turns out he's the boyfriend of a friend. I tell him I want a job at UB. I get an email from him, and he says, there's this job I think you'd be really perfect for that is hiring. Within 2 hours, I got an email from the department asking me to apply. And even though I had no intention of leaving Amherst, because I was reasonably happy, I took the leap of faith. When I showed up for the interview, the person who did the interview starts asking me questions about the weather. Note, it's January, right? This is like, I got hired toward the end of January. This is like early January. He says, oh, I hear the weather's not too bad. Now, I live in Buffalo, New York. So, you know, saying that the weather's not too bad in January, that's kind of neat, right? But it has nothing whatsoever to do with computing. And so I say yes, and we go down this path for a while. And eventually I said to him, aren't you going to ask me any technical questions? And he says, nah, I talked to Stu. Stu was the boyfriend that I had talked to before that, who had suggested I apply for the job. Now, I found out years later that conversation actually never did happen. So I'm not really sure what went on there. But he was the technical interviewer. I also interviewed with the woman who was in charge of that particular group, and ultimately they hired me. So here I am. I am now responsible for an NT4 server network, my own full NT network, including Exchange and SQL servers, and, you know, I'm making steps. Now, security, right? How did I get from there to where I am now? Well, that's an interesting story too, because even though I was responsible for all of this equipment, I already had a security mindset. I don't really know how or why. Maybe it was something that I learned by osmosis in the way that I grew up. But unlike a lot of folks here, we have a very distributed community. So there are groups like this one that I was working for that had their own servers. And most of them didn't do things like run firewalls on servers or on workstations, because that was not the norm. It didn't come with the operating system like it does now. It was not something people thought about. But as soon as something was available to put on my servers, Black Ice in particular, I was immediately drawn to do that. That was a very good thing. Fast forward a little while later, NIMDA hits. Now, I don't know how many of you know about NIMDA, but NIMDA was a pretty nasty worm, and it did a lot of damage to a lot of systems. Well, because of my community and my network of friends that I had started to build, I got word that Microsoft was releasing a patch for a very serious problem. And I found out about this, I think it was definitely in an evening, and I can't remember if it was like on a Sunday or if it was like in the middle of the week, but I heard about this. And so I came in and I patched all my systems. And the next morning when I walked in the door, I was told, you need to immediately go to this conference room. Tell your users not to turn on their computers. Okay. Not knowing what was going on, I go to that room. I listen to what these folks have to say, and they say, oh, there's this terrible thing. It's called NIMDA. Until you patch all your systems, whatever you do, don't turn them on. I came back from that meeting and said to my users, go ahead, turn your systems on. Now, again, certain amount of luck here, right? That I happened to hear about this and I happened to get ahead of it. But it was also the fact that I had my nose in a community that was talking about these kinds of things. And that helped me protect the people, well, indirectly, right? Their systems, and therefore the jobs that they were responsible for. A lot of the other folks here ultimately had to come in and patch their things, and their folks had to wait. My people were able to turn their systems on and just go forward. So it wasn't too long before we started to see other kinds of worms and other sorts of strange behavior. That was where I started to get to know somebody named Chenille. Chenille was a good friend of mine who worked in the central space for server support. So he and I started to talk about the subject of security. And I told him, you know, this is an area that I was really interested in. He was sent to his first SANS course. Now, this is back in the day. For those of you who've taken SANS classes in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, SANS classes are now things like 504, right? 610. This is back when SANS classes were things like 3, 4. So he took this class, which I think was class 3, and it was about network intrusion detection. And he started to teach me what he was learning, and I was fascinated by this. And he was one of the people that would get called out when a machine was doing something strange, and they wanted to start doing what we would now think of as sort of the rudiments of incident response. And he started to teach me what he knew. Fast forward another few years, and my boss at the time said, look, I'm going to give you some insight. The writing is on the wall. Our independent groups are going to get merged, for the most part, into some kind of help center. And if you don't pick a specialty area, that is where you're going to wind up. And because of my interest in security, and because of this work that I had done, and I started to be very interested in forensics, I picked security. That was the direction that I ultimately wanted to go. The security office here was founded in 2006. By 2007 and 8, I was already starting to do a little bit of forensics work. So it wasn't a huge choice to make that decision to go to security. And in 2009, I moved full-time in the security office. So here I am at UB. I'm working in my first job as an InfoSec analyst, kind of thinking, oh my God, I have no idea what I'm doing. Sound familiar? I'm sure there's nobody out there who has any kind of issues with, oh, I don't know, worrying about what they know, or, you know, that kind of thing, right? It's very, very common. And it absolutely, imposter syndrome was hardcore with me when I first started, and continues now, right? Like I'm still in a space, as I think most of us are, where there are things we know, and there's so much we don't know. But I was very fortunate because I was surrounded by people who are smarter than me, and they started to teach me, and I started to teach myself, and I became very curious. And ultimately, I found the hackers. Now, how did I find the hackers? I went to my very first B-Sides Rochester. Now, the way that came about was that the university decided to start what's called UB NetDef, which at the time was an independent study. And the purpose of the independent study was to participate in something called CCDC, which is the collegiate competition for cyber defense. And that was something that one of our former students had attended and was completely lost, but enjoyed it and really wanted to bring that back to the university. They brought a whole bunch of us together from the industry. So myself, other people who worked in corporate US, others, instructors at the university, and said, how can we build a class to do this? So at that class, I meet my very first offensive security professional, at least the first one that I knew of. And his name was Justin. And I was fascinated by what he was telling me because, of course, at this point, I know a whole lot about the patching and the maintenance and IR and a little about forensics, but I didn't know a whole lot about OffSec. In fact, I knew next to nothing. And I said, how do I learn more about that? And he says, you need to go to a B-Sides. And I said, what the heck is a B-Side? I'd never heard of this. And he says, oh, it's a really cool conference. There's a bunch of them all over the place. And they're, really inexpensive and they're usually very accessible and you should check it out. So I go look online and you can see that picture at the very top. That is in fact the screen from that very first B-Sides Rochester that I attended in April 2015. And the gentleman's picture to the left, whose handle is Algorithm was one of the founders of this conference. And I walked in the door and I really knew nobody. And I sat down next to people at a table and I asked them what they were doing. And they started to tell me. And they were so excited. Some of them were playing a CTF. Others were looking at what talks to attend. It was super cool. And Algorithm was particularly kind to me when I had questions. And it was something I didn't forget. The building down below, as you can see on the left, that was the German house. That was where this conference was held that year. It has since moved to a whole bunch of different places. It is currently at the RIT Inn and Convention Center. And full circle, I now run that conference. But it all started because somebody in the community said, you might want to check this out. And someone else from the community was particularly kind to me. It was a fabulous experience. The following year, I decided to try Cleveland. Rochester's about an hour and 15 minutes from here. Cleveland's maybe 3 hours, but still very, very drivable. At B-Sides Cleveland, I met a gentleman named Chris Roberts. I met him on a shuttle bus. We were both coming from the hotel. No idea who this guy was. Many of you might not know who he is. Many of you may know exactly who he is because he is somebody who's been in this community for a long time. He has a very interesting reputation, but I can honestly say at this point, he is a friend to me. He gave a really interesting talk about hacking cows that inspired me. It inspired me to start thinking about maybe giving a talk of my own, because as you saw, I was pretty comfortable on a stage. So this was the beginning of that inspiration. Now that summer, my husband and I went to our first DEF CON because I thought, I've been to these B-Sides, these are great, I'm going to check out DEF CON. And the picture in the lower left-hand corner is, in fact, my husband and I at DEF CON with some other folks who, I didn't want to include them because one of the things about DEF CON and photos is that without permission, generally, you don't want to include people in photos. So the obvious folks are blacked out just because, I would had to have gotten their explicit permission. But you can see we're having a good time. But realistically, my experience at DEF CON was not the greatest. That first DEF CON, I thought, this is okay. It's loud and there's a lot of people and wow, there were a lot of things to do and it was very overwhelming. And really the conference reputation preceded itself. And I thought, all right, I've had the experience. I discovered there were a lot of lines at DEF CON. I didn't really talk to people in great detail because I didn't really know a lot of people to ask about DEF CON. It was more like what I'd read and what other people that I knew had heard. The folks we were with were students, so they didn't really know a whole lot about it either. But the one bright spot I went to a place called Packet Hacking Village. And that is why you see this picture on the lower right-hand side. And the people in the village were super kind to me. I walked in and I love the logo. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but you know, it's a sheep dude. It's kind of cool. And I saw there were people wearing t-shirts and they had a little sheep dude on them. And I thought, oh, that's so badass. Like I walked up to somebody and I said, hey, how can I get one of those t-shirts? And he said to me, well, you know what? You were so nice in how you asked me. I will just give you one, which I found out after the fact was not the norm. And I found that out because the very next year, I came back to DEF CON. I was not planning to come back to DEF CON, but I'd had such a positive experience at the Packet Hacking Village. And I'd had this idea for a talk. And Chris had been so kind to me. He said, however I can help, reach out. I reached out. I gave him the idea for the talk. We flushed it out. I then thought, gee, I really should probably submit this somewhere. And I said, what do you think? I said, if I submit this at DEF CON, will you do it with me? And he said, yes. And we were accepted at Packet Hacking Village the very following year. And you can, it's hard to see because this is a screenshot from the video, but in August 2017, I gave my first talk at DEF CON in the village. So, you know, I'd come a long way from that point. Now, again, we've been talking over and over about it taking a village. Well, I got this brilliant idea over time because fast forward a number of years that I wanted to write a book. I had some ideas twirling around in my head. So we're talking a few years later. I come up with an outline. The thing you see in the lower left-hand corner is effectively a very shortened version of the outline I came up with. I sat down and started to talk to people. Now, meanwhile, I had been going to other conferences. I was attending ShmooCon. I had gone to a number of other conferences that I've even lost track of at this point. But I'd started volunteering with the Packet Hacking Village at DEF CON. So I came back to DEF CON again each year. Of course, not in 2020, although I was working remotely. And in 2021 at DEF CON 29, I started asking people that I thought were folks that really understood what I was trying to get across. And I said, what do you think about this idea? For those of you who know Grifter, he was one of the people I spoke to. For the folks who might know Polar, he was one of the folks I spoke to. And everybody I gave this idea to, even people I thought might not like it, they liked it. And I was encouraged. And then I went to Blue Team Con, the very first one that ever happened. And I met Sean. And that was my introduction to Trimark. And Sean was phenomenal. We met up after the fact. He liked the concept. And we started meeting monthly. He was gracious enough with his time to help. And ultimately, so are a host of lots of other people. These are just some of the faces that helped this book come to life. I could not have done this without the community. The community absolutely had my back and helped me write this book. And I'll tell you, Jake Williams, who's the picture in that top upper left corner, when I proposed the idea to Jake at Blue Team Con, he said, not only do you need to write this book, but I want to write the foreword. And I thought, oh shit, now I have to write a book. But, you know, it was amazing. And each of the people in this picture, and many, many more, because I could only fit so many in the screenshot, were incredibly helpful at making this happen. And in 2023, I published The Active Defender, which, as was mentioned, at least by Sean in the beginning, is really this look at defense from an offensive perspective. And how did I learn all that? From the community that I started to get to know, because I went to a B-Sides and it opened my eyes. And I thought, oh my God, had I had this information when I first started, that would have been absolutely incredible. So the book is out now. It's available everywhere. For those of you who are just starting out in the security space, I think you could find it very useful. That is what I am told. And I am readily available. I'm on the TriMark Discord. I'm Investigator Chick in all the things except Twitter, where I'm Investigator Ch. There's only an I, the last C is cut off, but that's how you can find me. Now, for all of you, how do you get there? Well, if anything, my story should have told you, listen to people you trust, right? Get to know some folks. And if you trust them, listen to their recommendations and advice. When you're given opportunities, grab them with both hands, follow them through. Volunteer, even if you only have an hour, a couple hours, a few minutes, jump in wherever you think you might find something to learn. Do continuous professional development. I mean, if I hadn't done all the things I did to get where I am, I would have stayed that young lady who kind of knew something about computers, but never really formalized her education. And networking, my friends, it's all about who you know. What you know is what keeps you in the door, but frequently who you know is what gets you in the door. Number one rule, surround yourself with people who are smarter than you. I guarantee you will look smarter for having done it. And I will finalize by saying, I love this quote from Douglas Adams. I may not have gone where I intended to go, clearly, but I think ultimately I ended up exactly where I needed to be. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Danny.
TriMark Vision is the next evolution in the identification of security issues across all your Active Directory environments. The TriMark Risk Score is based on real-world expertise of TriMark's industry-leading Active Directory and Microsoft Cloud security experts. Most importantly, TriMark Vision helps you to answer the questions facing your Active Directory security posture today, such as what risk do I have in my environment? What actionable steps can I take today, tomorrow, this week to best mitigate my risk of an attack on my Active Directory? What should I be most concerned about within my Active Directory forest where it concerns potential attack vectors? What is the current security posture of all my AD forests? TriMark Vision, visibility at the speed of operations.